Hello, this is Doris Ann Mertz from the Custer County Library. Welcome to part 2 of our ACT English Prep course. We finished off part 1 talking about using commas to separate extra information, and now we're going to talk about that there are 3 different ways you can separate information. So you use a comma when you are wanting the extra information to just seem neutral. In this example, the group, led by Max, hiked through the forest. So this is extra information. You could take it out and the sentence still makes sense. The group hiked through the forest. But you're just telling that the group was led by Max. But it's kind of neutral information. You can use parentheses when you're separating relevant but secondary information. It's kind of like an aside or something you're whispering when you're using parentheses. So here's an example. There's an exception to every rule, including this one. You always use them as a set. You never use parentheses like one side of a parentheses. That's just, you can't do that. Okay, and you use a dash when you're separating relevant but not essential information that you want to stress. It's kind of like you're highlighting that. You're not whispering it, you're stressing it. So, her taste in music, from country to rap, exemplifies her eclectic personality. So, use commas when it's neutral, parentheses when it's an aside, and dashes when you're wanting to stress it. And use them in pairs. So on the ACT, if the passage has a dash right here, and this part's not underlined, and then there's an underlined part, and it gives you several options. Since there's a dash here, the other side needs to be a dash. Now, if it came at the end of the sentence, you wouldn't have to, except in the case of parentheses. But if it's in the middle of the sentence, you got to use comma, comma, or dash, dash, and you always use parentheses, a set of them. So we're going to talk about the semicolon now. A semicolon is something that connects two related and independent clauses without the use of a conjunction. So you don't use it to just attach any two sentences together. They kind of have to be related. But we talked about commas earlier and how a comma and a fanboy is the most common way to connect two independent clauses. I like ice cream, comma, and she likes yogurt. But you can also do that with a semicolon. I like ice cream, she likes yogurt. But you do not use the conjunction. It's used like a period, except you don't capitalize the next letter. So all of these are correct. I like ice cream, she likes yogurt, the semicolon. I like ice cream and she likes yogurt, the comma and the fanboy, and I like ice cream, period, she likes yogurt. This is incorrect. I've said this in the last time, we never use a semicolon and an and unless we're separating, like in this case down here, items in a list. We don't use it when we're joining independent clauses. So semicolons, the next reason they're used are to connect items in a list if the list already has commas in it. So the contestants were from Baltimore, Maryland, semicolon, Denver, Colorado, semicolon, Phoenix, Arizona, semicolon, and Nashville, Tennessee. So this would be a very confusing sentence without the use of the semicolons. You had to use them because there's already commas between the city and state, and it just makes the list make sense using the semicolons. All right, you also use semicolons before conjunctive adverbs such as however, moreover, and therefore when they're used to begin a clause. All right, here's an example. London is an old city, semicolon. However, comma, it has many new buildings. And remember, you don't capitalize the letter that comes after it. You can use however in the middle of a sentence like we saw in the last lesson. You can offset it with commas. London is an old city. It does, however, have many new buildings. So in this case, it's not being used as a conjunctive adverb. It's thrown in there as extra information. It's not connecting an independent clause to the sentence before, to the clause before. All right, we're going to talk about colons now. We've covered commas, we've covered semicolons, and now colons. Colons are used most often to introduce a list of 3 or more items. So this is an example. Colons have 3 functions: introducing long list, introducing quotations, and introducing explanations. So as we said, the second one is to introduce quotations. Most of the time you use a comma, but if you really want to emphasize it, or if it's a long quote, then you could use a colon, or if you just really want to stress that quote. So you would use it at the end of the clause stating who says it, and then use the colon and then the quote. And you also use it to introduce an explanation, like this example. There's only one thing to do. Go to the police and tell them everything. All right. Now, sometimes you could use a dash in this sentence too, but if you were using a dash, you would not capitalize the go to the police and tell them everything. But you do capitalize after the colon when it's used to introduce an explanation. All right, we're going to talk about incomplete and run-on sentences. So to be a complete sentence, you must have a subject and a verb. You got to express a complete thought. Otherwise, it's incomplete or a sentence fragment. We talked about those conjunctions the other day, like because and since, and how when they're in a clause and there's not another clause, it just doesn't make sense. Like before we woke up, that's not a complete sentence. So the run-on sentence occurs when one sentence just kind of runs right into another one. So it's not like a sentence fragment. It's just like there's no punctuation. Or there's just a comma, and a comma is not strong enough to separate two complete sentences on its own without the use of a fanboy. All right, let's look at some examples. The debate was over. Now it was time to vote. This comma is not strong enough to separate these two sentences. This is a clause on its own. The debate was over. Now it was time to vote. That can stand on its own too. You could do it by changing it to a period and capitalizing the now. You could do it by the comma and the fanboy. You could do it with a semicolon and do not capitalize afterwards. You could do it with a dash. Or you could try rearranging it and doing it with a subordinating conjunction. Since the debate was over, comma, it was time to vote. So those are ways to correct this run-on sentence. Let's look at some different examples of sentences and fragments and decide what they are. So, Louis Armstrong was one of the greatest jazz musicians of the 20th century. Is that a complete sentence? Yes, it expresses a complete thought. So this is a sentence, not a fragment. He was one of the greatest jazz musicians of the 20th century. Once again, that makes sense, so it's a sentence. Louis Armstrong, who was one of the greatest jazz musicians of the 20th century. Do you feel like that was complete, or does it feel like you're waiting for something else? It feels like you're waiting for something else because this is not a complete sentence. This is a fragment. Who was one of the greatest jazz musicians of the 20th century? This is also not a complete sentence. Now, if this would have had a question mark, it would have been a question, and that would have been a complete thought. But this is a fragment the way it is because you're waiting for them to tell you what happened with that. Louis Armstrong, who was one of the greatest jazz musicians of the 20th century, was a vocalist as well as a trumpet player. So that does express a complete sentence. It does give you some extra information here in the middle, and that extra information is set off by a pair of commas. Today, he is considered one of the greatest jazz musicians of the 20th century. That, once again, is a sentence. All right. I think we've had enough practice on that. So let's talk about apostrophes for possessive nouns. Apostrophes make nouns possessive. For singular nouns, you always add apostrophe and a S, like in the dog's bone. For plural nouns, you always add the S and then the apostrophe, or you add an ES if the noun ends in S. So the dogs, bowls. So that lets you know there's more than one dog. It's not just one dog we're talking about, it's several dogs and several bowls. The dresses, zippers. So we're talking about more than one dress and more than one zipper. So a noun followed by another noun should contain an apostrophe. A noun followed by anything else should not. So that's just a little trick, because sometimes people start adding apostrophes where they're not needed. So this example, the first example, the king's daughter was beautiful. King is a noun, daughter is a noun. Put an apostrophe S in there because the king is modifying whose daughter it is, so it's telling you whose daughter. The kings waged war against each other. So kings is a noun, waged is a verb, and you're not going to need an apostrophe S there. All right, the Smiths went to the Christmas parade. We do not need an apostrophe S there. it's a noun followed by a verb. Now, a lot of people end up, especially when they're doing Christmas cards, they end up putting apostrophe S's where they don't need them. So if you're talking about the Smiths, the individuals in the Smith family, and that's just a plural form of Smith, then you just need an S, not an apostrophe. All right. Let's look at an example. This is the kind of the way that ACT questions are set up. They're set up in a passage and everything is correct except the only thing in question is what's underlined. So, since I was a child, my family has gathered at my grandparents' home in Maine each summer. My grandmother and grandfather bought it nearly 50 years ago and still live there from June to September. I only read that second sentence because I was just wondering if it's one grandparent or two grandparents, but they both are still living and still live there. So we're talking about two people here. So we've got several options. One is the no change, that this is correct, apostrophe S. The other is that it's S apostrophe. The other option is that it's S no apostrophe. And the other option is that it's S no apostrophe and then a comma after the end of home. So which do you think it is? So since there's more than one grandparent, it's a plural noun, so we're going to need to use the S apostrophe, B. All right, let's look at the next one. The house's rooms are bright and airy, and I love to sit on the deck and watch the waves roll in. So how many houses are there? There's one house, right? We're talking about the grandparents' home. There's one house. So do we need the no change option that has S apostrophe? Do we need G, which is the apostrophe S, and another apostrophe S for the rooms? Or do we need H, which is just apostrophe S, and then rooms without an apostrophe? Or do we need no apostrophes in this sentence? Well, let's use our little tip we learned about how a noun followed by another noun always needs an apostrophe. So this one does need an apostrophe because there's two nouns there. But is it a plural noun or singular? We decided it's one house and it's singular, so it's going to need to be apostrophe S. We have two options out here. One just has the plural form of rooms and one has the possessive form of rooms. Let's look at our noun followed by noun rule again. So rooms is followed by R. So no, we do not need an apostrophe. This is just a plural form of the word room. So the correct answer would be H. All right, let's look at another one. I learned that I should build plywood enclosures in each of my parents' backyards so that Rosie would be safe year-round. So are we talking about one parent or two? We're talking about each of my parents' backyards. So we're talking about a singular subject. So let's look down here at our options and see, oh yes, right there, B, we have the singular possessive form, we have an apostrophe S, so that is going to be our answer because these are two nouns, parents and backyard, so we're going to need an apostrophe S, B. All right, let's talk some more about apostrophes. These are some common mistakes that people make. You do not use apostrophes with pronouns, which is kind of hard because you're used to showing possessive form with apostrophes when it's a noun, but when it's a pronoun, you don't do it. So it's versus it is. It's versus it's. It's with an apostrophe always means it is. All right? It never is the possessive form of it. So it always means it is. You got to take out, you got to replace the it's with it is and see if that makes sense. If it doesn't, that's not the correct form. All right, we got there, and there. So there with an apostrophe always means they are. There is the possessive form of they, and there is denoting a place, like there's here, there, and everywhere. So just remember, there with an apostrophe always means they are. Let's look at your versus your. Your with an apostrophe always means you are. So all you got to do is substitute the you are in there, and if it makes sense, you should use your with an apostrophe, and if it doesn't, you're going to need to use your. All right, whose versus whose, same rule. Whose with an apostrophe always means who is. So just remember to apply that rule every time. All right, we've already talked about there is a location, there is possessive form of they, and there always means they are. All right, let's look at some examples. Thailand is full of bright colors. It's a country whose inhabitants spontaneously plant flowers. So, do we need apostrophe S? Does it is make sense here? It is a country whose inhabitants plant flowers. Yes, so we do need an apostrophe there. All right, so it's a country whose inhabitants. Does who is make sense here? It's a country who is inhabitants. That does not make sense. So we know this is not correct. So let's look over here at what our other options are. It's a country. So we know that well, really we don't need to look any further than B because we know it needs to be it's with an apostrophe. But this has the correct form of whose as well. So it's going to be B. I just want to point out that it's with S apostrophe is never ever a word. If that's in the answer, you know that's wrong. That is not a word, okay? Where the impressive and countless temples emit their glory with an abundance of gold and red. All right, let's replace that with they are. Emit, they are glory. That makes no sense. So we know that's not the correct form. So we got to decide, is it the form that denotes a location or that denotes possession. So it's their glory, this one, possession, because it's not a location. So it's going to be H, their, T-H-E-I-R. All right, let's go on down and look at a couple of more examples. Among the encyclopedia's articles was an entry about Amy Lowell, who's best known for her patterns. All right, let's look at number 1 first. Number 1, among the encyclopedia's articles. Do we need apostrophe S there? It's a noun followed by a noun. Yes, we need an apostrophe S there. But do we need, it looks like they've added some apostrophes out after articles up here. Do we need that? No, this one is followed by a verb, so we don't need an apostrophe there. So in this example, it's going to be the no change is the correct option because there's ones that don't have the possessive form of encyclopedia. This one is several encyclopedias. Wait, let's see. Sorry about that. Yes, and this, since we were only talking about one encyclopedia, the correct answer is A, no change. So let's look at this Amy Lowell, whose. We're being tested on the correct form of whose. So should it be whose with no apostrophe, or should we use a who is, which would require an apostrophe? So let's say Amy Lowell, who is best known for her patterns. So who is does make sense. So we know we were going to need this form of whose, G. So the answer is G. All right, thank you for watching part 2 of ACT English Prep, and I'll talk to you next time.